In 1969, a young unwed mother, somebody who was pregnant and going to give birth soon, named Norma McCorvey, sought to get an abortion in the city of Dallas and ultimately was denied. And therefore, she began to look at legal options of how she could actually pursue an abortion. Even though she had the child and the child was put up for adoption, her case was still pursued, largely with help from the ACLU. It was this case that eventually became known as Roe versus Wade. Norma McCorvey was the Roe of the case. Ultimately, Justice Harry Blackmun, who actually oversaw much of the arguments for this case, along with the rest of the Supreme Court, led the decision that legalized abortion in every single state by defining life of a human as being determined by its viability. There's this whole idea that humanity or human life or personhood, if you will, only can be seen as a person if that life can exist outside the womb. Of course, this was an arbitrary decision because the ability for human life to exist outside of the womb is always being changed based upon new medical breakthroughs and technology. That's why you have this rather extreme juxtaposition, this rather extreme opposite of differences in a hospital that, say, performs abortions on one floor and also performs on a different floor some of the most remarkable prenatal care, or especially care of premature infants on yet another floor. That kind of difference is what we're actually talking about. And Schaeffer, who mentioned that this law was medically arbitrary, also pointed out that it was also legally arbitrary, because it removed the whole idea of a person being a person from those who could not live outside the womb, or so it was said, from an entire class of people. Schaeffer actually said this was a more dramatic ruling than the Dred Scott case, which essentially declared that all African Americans were not citizens. That along with the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which counted slaves as being 3/5 of a person and belittled their personhood, Schaeffer says this went a whole step further because it did not even guarantee a right to life amongst these people. And so it legalized abortion. Abortion that has now caused the death of some 60 million people through some of the most barbaric methods that are actually out there. In other words, this was something that dramatically changed the way that we live and move in our country. Norma McCorvey, who was the Roe of Roe versus Wade, would later become a believer and has been working for the repeal of this law ever since. It also, of course, would launch an entire movement of pro-life activists who would actually not just work against the law, but would actually actively appear at the various clinics performing abortions and offering alternatives to this dark practice.